Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're mapping out Abu Yaqub al-Marzuki's really profound, incredibly detailed philosophical critique on how civilizations actually survive, how they interact, and, how they occasionally stumble. If you've ever wondered how ancient historical narratives are actively shaping our reality right now, or how old philosophies still dictate global power dynamics, well, you're definitely in the right place. Because honestly, understanding these ancient traps is kind of the only way we can recognize the modern ones we're currently living in. We're going to dive into epistemological dilemmas, the whole clash between Greek and Islamic thought, and what it truly means for a civilization to achieve universality. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by debunking Western civilizational myths, define the conditions of universality, and then check out the critical Islamic school. From there, we'll unpack the obstacles of philosophy and theology, the dilemma of fiqh and Sufism, and finally, look at the trap of modernity. Okay, Section 1, debunking Western civilizational myths. We're kicking things off by examining what al-Marzuki calls the great illusions of Western and Greek civilizational exceptionalism. He argues that a huge chunk of our modern historical narrative is built on these foundational myths that we really need to critically dismantle. To wrap our heads around this, we have to go right back to the roots of Greek philosophy. Aristotle famously claimed, and I quote, that Greeks are brave but foolish, while Asians are smart but cowardly. Al-Marzuki uses this specific quote to brilliantly illustrate the ancient master-slave worldview. He argues that this entire Greek philosophical framework inherently relies on a deeply ingrained racism, this whole notion of a chosen people. It literally categorizes humanity into rigid hierarchies, where some folks are naturally destined to be masters, and everyone else relegated to being subjects. Just think for a second about how a mindset like that might influence centuries of foreign policy and conquest down the line. Now, contrast that incredibly hierarchical view with the Islamic alternative. Al-Marzuki points out that Islamic civilization, at least in principle, sought to completely erase this master-slave dynamic. He roots this directly in two key Quranic concepts that represented a massive paradigm-shifting historical change. First up, the establishment of universal human brotherhood, stemming from a single soul, and second, the declaration of absolute equality. The idea here is that any differentiation between people is based strictly on righteousness and piety, not race, not lineage. It's an absolute rejection of the idea that any one group has inherent supremacy over another. Which brings us to a really core concept of the entire text, universality. True universality, according to the author, isn't about one culture dominating another, not at all. It's about achieving civilizational survival through two interconnected pillars, the material building of the earth and the spiritual stewardship of humanity. He entirely rejects the idea of isolated civilizational miracles, like the so-called Greek miracle. Instead, he favors continuous, historical cross-pollination. The idea is that civilizations build on one another. They don't just magically pop out of thin air to save the world. Moving into Section 2, conditions of universality. Let's see exactly how this builds the foundation for cross-cultural inheritance and real human progress. The text strongly emphasizes that civilizations absolutely do not arise in vacuums. They survive through this continuous material and spiritual exchange. Because of this, the author argues that modern Western claims of a direct, exclusive lineage straight back to Greece, somehow totally bypassing the centuries in between, are, well, a historical myth. Al-Marzuki actually calls this the second European lie. He says it's a narrative designed specifically to erase the massive Islamic contributions to the Renaissance and to ignore the undeniable cross-pollination that really drove human history forward. So, what are the actual conditions for this universal civilizational unity? Well, al-Marzuki lays them out pretty clearly. We've got universal human brotherhood and absolute equality. We have mutual inheritance, which just means sharing material and spiritual gains across different cultures. But here is the crucial part. Achieving true universality requires two more absolute rejections. First, the rejection of clergy, meaning no spiritual intermediaries between humans and God. And second, the rejection of theocracy, no political guardianship by a church. Essentially, you cannot achieve true universality without totally dismantling both ethnic superiority and religious priesthoods. Now into Section 3, the critical Islamic school. Because, as you might guess, realizing this universal theory philosophically was incredibly difficult in practice. Look, changing a civilization's entire philosophical foundation, that does not happen overnight. Al-Marzuki maps out an epic 8-century struggle within Islamic thought to completely break free from that flawed Greek worldview. It started way back in the early centuries with these really complex theological debates between the Mu'tazila and Ash'ari schools. But the heavy lifting came later. You've got Al-Ghazali taking a sledgehammer to Greek metaphysics in the 11th century, Ibn Taymiyyah dismantling Greek epistemology in the 14th, and then Ibn Khaldun critiquing Greek anthropology in the 15th century. It was this massive, multi-generational intellectual effort to untangle Islamic thought from inherited Greek influence. Let's hit Section 4, Obstacles of Philosophy and Theology. Despite those massive critical breakthroughs we just talked about, internal roadblocks severely hindered civilizational progress. Let's see what went wrong on the inside. Al-Marzuki diagnoses these failures by splitting them right down the middle into two massive roadblocks. On the theoretical side, you have philosophy and kalam, or theology, just getting entirely bogged down. They were trying to blend Greek philosophy with this superficial layer of monotheism. Then, on the practical side, you have fiqh, which is Islamic law, and Sufism. They were blending rigid legal mechanics with vague, esoteric spiritual claims. So instead of breaking free, the civilization essentially got trapped. They were caught between trying to philosophize too much, like the Greeks, on one hand, and mysticize too much on a daily basis on the other. Let's drill down into that first theoretical obstacle. Al-Marzuki points out a severe regression in philosophy and kalam. Thinkers basically failed to properly critique the Greek heritage, and instead made these very superficial attempts to synthesize Islam with Greek thought. And the result? A profound scholastic stagnation. The author explicitly points to some major intellectual titans here, figures like Ibn Arabi, Ibn Rushd, Razi, and Suhrawardi. By highlighting these specific heavyweights, he's showing us that this failure crossed both Eastern and Western Islamic thought. It inadvertently kept the intellectual culture chained to those unexamined Greek flaws. Which brings us to Section 5, the dilemma of fiqh and Sufism. We are moving from the theoretical down to practical philosophy and daily life. Here, the author sharply critiques how daily practice got so distorted. On the legal side, fiqh was manipulated. People were overextending legal analogies, known as qiyas, and misusing the objectives of the law, or maqasid, to falsely fill what some claimed were gaps in divine law. Meanwhile, on the spiritual side, Sufism really devolved. It went from a genuine pursuit of piety into claiming this exclusive knowledge of the unseen. Al-Marzuki argues this effectively created a hidden, botanist church within Islam. And I mean, what happens when a group claims exclusive spiritual authority? They almost always end up making alliances with political tyrants just to maintain control over the masses. Section 6, the trap of modernity. All this historical context brings us right up to the present day, and the incredibly perilous trap that modern intellectual elites find themselves in. The author argues that modern and postmodern Western philosophies, championed by figures from Hegel all the way to Marx, actually abandoned the pursuit of universal truth entirely. Instead of moving past it, they regressed right back to that old Aristotelian master-slave dynamic. But this time, it was cleverly disguised under the noble-sounding banner of a civilizing mission or driven by the illusion of superior spirits of nations. Guys, it's the exact same old hierarchy, just wearing a very modern suit. And this leads right into the tragic irony of our current era. Al-Marzuki maps out what he brutally calls the Arab elite's pipeline of degradation. It goes like this. In their rush to modernize, they misunderstand the true objectives of Islamic law. Step 2, they start secularizing texts just to appease modern tyrants. Then they historicize the Quran, basically claiming its rules only apply to the past, which strips it of its universal authority. And finally, they replace divine universal laws with totally malleable, man-made positive law. So in their sheer desperation to escape the past, they end up adopting the very master-slave hierarchy they really should be resisting. So what's the way forward here? Al-Marzuki concludes that true civilizational survival relies on recognizing what he calls sunan, these permanent, universal laws. These laws are constant, okay? They do not change based on the era or whoever happens to be sitting on a throne. They govern human societies and the natural world alike. Acknowledging them means completely rejecting the historicization of divine texts. And what's really fascinating here is that he notes these laws can actually be formulated quantitatively in the hard sciences and qualitatively in the humanities. They are the literal bedrock of reality, totally independent of any one culture's ego. Which leaves us with a really critical, lingering question to wrap up on. If civilizations truly survive through cross-pollination and a strict adherence to unchanging universal laws, what happens to us when we abandon those laws just to chase the illusion of cultural superiority? It is an incredibly powerful warning against the traps of both ancient hierarchies and our postmodern myths. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. I really hope exploring these concepts helped clarify what is an incredibly dense but highly rewarding text. Keep questioning those narratives you inherit, and we'll see you next time.